Welcome to the Sanity podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, we speak to the people that you want to hear from.
We're joined this week by Dr. Jennifer Sciubba. She is the president and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau. She has an expertise in aging, political demography, research translation, environment, fertility. In 2022, she published a book, 8 Billion and Counting, How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. Dr. Sciubba, we're really happy to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Hello, glad to be here.
We should start at the beginning, which is this question of, do we have too many people on the planet or too few? It's been a long held debate. The famous professor Paul Ehrlich had written The Population Bomb, arguing that there were going to be too many people and there wouldn't be enough resources and we would all starve. And Elon Musk, of course, in the last year or so has been very vocal about the need for everybody to do what he seems to be doing, which is
I was just going to say, word in action.
A lot of children, because we are underpopulated around the world. So can you just give us a general sense globally and more specifically in the United States, where we stand? Do we have too many or too few people?
That is a great question, and one that I find people still are incredibly divided on, as you said. I mean, as a student of population history, you can watch the contours of this debate even before Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, who bet him about the future of the planet. People have always wondered this, and I think it gets to more fundamentally an issue about population, which is that it's not just the numbers that matter, it's the perception. So we are at a place now where overall, more people are being added to the planet every day. And depending on how long I live, I may or may not see peak population, but pretty much certainly we will see it this century. When I tell people that, though, I kind of take the first couple of seconds to read their faces to see which side of this they're on, because half the people I speak with will say, well, that didn't happen fast enough, or it can't get here soon enough, or it's still not low enough. And then half the people have this panic behind their eyes that this is an existential crisis for the world.
What do you mean when you say peak population? Give us a sense.
Sure. So we're looking at where the most people we will ever have on the planet at one point in time. So yes, in November 2022, we hit that 8 billion number. And we will probably add another 1 to 2 billion. That the probably part depends on how fast births come down in places where they're still high. And there are fewer of those places in the world now. And it also depends on how low they go where they're currently low, or whether they perhaps turn around. So a little bit of a margin of error in there, but frankly, it doesn't really matter if we're talking about being zoomed out. We're nearly at that peak.
So what do you think? I mean, do we have to?
It's neither one, because, and I actually think we can come at this from an evidence standpoint, because you can have the same demographic trend in two different places and it has two very different outcomes. Let's think, for example, there's a lot of good research that shows that countries with really youthful populations, so this would be places that have had lots of births and the average age is quite young, those are more likely to have coups. But not every youthful country has a coup. And in fact, in a lot of these youthful countries, this is seen as the world's future workforce, and the idea that, well, if you're going to have economic growth, you would need this youthful population. So it's not that demography is destiny. And I think that's what underlies this question about, are there too many or too few? It is, how closely is demography tied to destiny? And I say it's important, but it's absolutely not the determining factor.
It's sort of, I'm thinking of Africa, right? Where on the one hand, you often hear Africa is like, the future, both in terms of its diaspora, its workforce, its youth. But of course, it's also, as you said, there's a link there maybe to violence, political instability. I mean, you look at some of the average ages in some of these countries, they're remarkably young.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think you've said that there's really three factors that influence population: birth, migration, and death. So maybe the thing to do is to sort of take each one by one and talk about all the influences and impacts of each. So to start with birth, fertility rates, are they going up in the United States? Let's maybe start with the United States and focus there. Where are our birth rates today? Are we going up? Are we going down? And what are the different economic, cultural, health factors that are impacting those rates?
Well, we are definitely going down, and we're not alone in that. So I do think it's useful to set the U.S. in context because it helps us to understand those factors that do weigh into driving it down. We are now at a place where 2 out of every 3 people on the planet live somewhere with what's called below replacement fertility rates. So if you think about, having 2 parents, below replacement is below 2. And the United States is one of those countries. So right now, our average number of children born per woman is somewhere around 1.6 to 1.7. That's on the relatively higher end of low compared to places like Singapore, for example, where the average is 1, or South Korea, where the average is well below 1 and continuing to decline. But we are most certainly in that pool of countries where fertility rates are below replacement level. And there are many reasons for that. Again, zooming out is useful because it says, hey, there's not actually anything special about the United States. I think that's really important for us because when we think of this as, what do we do with the information that fertility rates are down? It helps us to understand that there may not be a lot we can do to change those fertility rates. When you're part of a global phenomenon, that's really tough. And I'm sure that's something we'll talk about here. But yeah, all the reasons you would expect. Think about your own decisions for if you have children or not, when you had them and how many you had. All those things factor in, like economic cost, right? Where are you in your career? What was your education level? Did you get to where you wanted before you decided to start a family? Do you have a partner? Do you have a supportive partner? Can you afford a home? How big is your home? Is childcare accessible? What's the opportunity cost of having children? Like, does it seem fun? Or would you rather spend your time and money doing something else? And even how hopeful do you feel about the future? Which that may be a funny one to kind of latch on to, but it's one of the ones that has really haunted me ever since I became interested in this as a topic decades ago. And I think it's something we tend to overlook because it's incredibly hard for us to think about measuring as a social scientist. And yet we know that it matters. And in this particular moment where I'm sure you feel the same as I do, that news is just overwhelmingly negative all the time. I think is becoming a growing factor in how we feel about our desires for families and social connection and friendships and communities.
Does the cultural breakdown of the family itself impact that as well? We don't have traditional families in the same sense that we used to 50 years ago. Has that affected the birth rates? The fertility rates?
I would say we don't necessarily know. These are the pieces like, on the one hand, the people who are having children these days really want to have them. And I think this is something that many social scientists recognize, that if you didn't really want to have children in the past, you might not have been able, for various reasons, even including like contraceptive access or maybe, abusive marriage, all sorts of reasons, you might have had them anyway. But fewer, that's becoming less of a problem, certainly still an issue. So that kind of goes against that piece a little bit. And yet we also know that there's some larger, there are these larger sociocultural issues like community. And that's the one that I tend to think the most about, because we live our lives so hyper locally, and yet we think about these issues from a national level, and we talk about things like population, but really we're talking about people, individuals, and where they're situated.
Mm-hmm. And is there like a demographic sweet spot? Like, should we be at replacement? Should we be above? If you would think about kind of all the factors, because I think there's a little bit of a Rorschach test dynamic here, where depending on your political or cultural affiliations, you're looking at these numbers and you're seeing different things, right? Some people see the lower numbers and say people have more choice. Women they can pursue the course of a life in many different ways than they could before. Others see as a sign of decline and decadence and sort of, loss of hope. So is there a sense of like, okay, where should we be at versus where we are? Or is it really just a kind of shifting kaleidoscope that you kind of see what you want to see?
Well, just to add to that practically, 2 for 2 doesn't sound like replacement to me, because life happens people die, accidents. So shouldn't replacement value be above 2 per couple?
Yeah, on that last piece, it kind of is above it. We say 2 for convenience, but in different countries, the replacement level is technically slightly different. So if you do live in a place with high infant and child mortality, it's above 2.1 even, because it's a horrible way to phrase it. We statistically call it margin of error, to make up for those children who don't make it to reproductive ages. But in the US, for example, where infant and child mortality is relatively lower, it's less, replacement level is considered less than 2.1, but above 2. So yeah, that's a good point there. As to the sweet spot piece, there is a sweet spot, but it's politically, not demographically. So there's no real demographic reason that a society needs to be at any certain number. I think, and this is where I show my bias as a political scientist who uses demography to understand the world. It's the political part that gives you a sweet spot. Because if, for example, you have set up your entitlement system as a pay-as-you-go entitlement system, like we have in the United States, where the current pool of workers pays into a pool of money from which the current older age dependents take from, then you will need to have a replenished and robust current pool of workers relative to the number of people who have already exited the workforce. So if you don't have that, then you've got to change that system. Well, good luck. Good luck changing that system, right? And so therefore the sweet spot is the spot that allows you to keep that system without having to change it because it's politically difficult. And that's the case, broadly speaking, for our societies right now. I would really say that much of the hand-wringing over below replacement fertility is because our systems are simply not set up for that reality. And even our theories are not. Like the way we are educated and understand the world, economic theories, they are built on this baseline assumption of continued population growth and youthful population. And so we don't really have a language, a vocabulary, theories to understand this new reality. And we certainly know how difficult it will be to actually have the kind of institutional changes needed to be resilient in this world. Like there's not a real sweet spot. Who cares what size the population actually is? It's just that it makes it much harder to keep the status quo.
To what extent do abortion rates in the United States have any effect on replacement fertility?
That is a very tough question for us to understand. It's a good question, but it's really hard for us to know some of that. Because what we want to do is we want to disaggregate preferences from actual births. And I think it's the same thing with health, kind of the same question of like, to what extent does maybe infertility affect this? And we could kind of put these two together. So I've seen some preliminary estimates that since abortions have become more restricted in the last few years, there have been more births than would have been expected. So that would be that they did raise the births slightly. It's like a 1 percentage point, somewhere around there in certain states. And it's among lower socioeconomic groups. So helping, if we disaggregate it in terms of groups, the people of the highest socioeconomic status, it doesn't seem to have affected that at all. Looks like preliminary estimates show it to be higher for other groups. But that doesn't mean that it changed the preferences piece of it, which I think is really interesting for us when we kind of zoom out and say, overall, people's preferences are shifting so that they don't want as many children. And then in that case, abortion policy would just be a tool that helps you act on those preferences.
Got it.
You mentioned that sort of America may not be super exceptional in this regard, and I agree with you. That's really helpful. It's sort of like sometimes when you think you're special, it actually clouds your judgment or it distorts things. Sort of looking globally, are there any countries that particularly interest you in terms of birth rates, either for them being unusually high or unusually low or having changed unusually dramatically? Are there any sort of interesting bellwethers or outliers around the world?
Yeah, the ones to me that are the most interesting are actually the ones that are very low because, and this connects to what I said about preferences. At the same time that we know people prefer fewer children over time, we also know that in many countries, they are having fewer than they would prefer. And so when there's that gap, I think that's really meaningful. And it also opens up some space for policy. Like, how do you help people have the number of children they desire, whether it's fewer, whether it's more? And so Finland is very interesting to me because this is a country where
the happiest country in the world, right? Every year they're rated the happiest country in the world. Yeah.
They're happy, strong social safety nets, relatively small, which sometimes we think about that as being a sweet spot for policymaking.
Happy because they have low birth rates? Is that what we're saying?
No, maybe
they have a fertility rate. Well, what would you think it would be? Like, what are you and think about what we have always thought we knew about Finland? Like, how many kids per woman would you expect Finland to have?
1.5.
Yeah. I mean, around maybe 1.5 or 2. I don't know.
Yeah, or higher, right? And that's what we thought for a lot. They were on that relatively higher end. Like all the things we thought were going to be the
Finnish people are beautiful, right? They're happy. It's a socially cohesive society, right? I mean, it sort of would be, you'd think would be high, yeah.
And it's 1.3.
Yeah.
Which is low. That is low. And I find that very interesting and want to know more. And I'm sure your follow-up question as mine would be, well, why is that the case? And so I think what it shows us is it is just so complicated to figure out why fertility rates are low, and you will not boil it down to one or two factors. It is just this big mix of things. I mean, even influences of technology, which we don't have great evidence of linking influence of technology and fertility rates. But we all know, we can feel how that's changed our lives and the way we interact. I'm also very interested in South Korea, where the rate, I hear that even though the last official statistics I had seen published were 0.7, I have just returned from there. I'm headed back there soon, that the newer ones will say 0.6. So that's 0.6 children born per woman on average. This has not happened at the country level before. What does that mean? Does it mean that people are unwilling to, or women are unwilling to reproduce that society the way it stands? I think of it in this case, the reason I'm fascinated is I think it's an indicator. So we talk a lot about low fertility rates or fertility in general as a cause of something. It can also be an indicator. And I think with societies that surprise me with whatever their rate is, I want to know more about what that indicates in the society.
Do you think it's as simple as saying this is a question of affluence, that in affluent societies people have less kids, or in societies that are less religious? I mean, those would just be two, in a very crude way, things I'd think about, right?
And no, and that again, I love surprises. So Thailand, for example, has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, 1 child born per woman. Mexico and the United States are nearly identical in their total fertility rate. So we do see this. The general statement that poorer societies or lower income societies would have higher fertility rates, that is a generally true statement. But what is so fascinating to us is that we see this as a global trend.
What I always think is so interesting is that the decision to have children, I think, just on an individual level, has so much to do with your outlook for the future and your sense of wanting to pass whatever it is on. So I think it would extend to nations as well. A sense of pride in your country and ownership of a country would mean that you would want a next generation to continue on with those values and that country. And so population is not just about numbers, right? It's about the nature of a place, a family, or a country. And so this leads us into the migration conversation, because a lot of the countries, let's say in Western Europe, that have low replacement fertility rates are allowing in huge numbers of migrants. So, from a pure numbers point of view, maybe that's sort of solving for some of the future economic issues or creating others. But it's also changing the nature of the place itself, and so just one feed off the other. And are we experiencing that in a different way here in the United States as well?
Yeah, you get at some like cocktail conversation questions, I think, because it's like, what is the nation and who is the nation? I will never forget in graduate school, this book that at the time I thought was so boring, and yet here I am thinking about it decades later, From Peasants into Frenchmen. And it was about the making of the French nation and how people would go, government basically would go door to door and say, you must speak this dialogue. You must use this symbolism and to turn France into France. And so, to be very zoomed out about this, and again, political scientists, we're always engaged in making the nation. It is an active thing that is done. Sometimes it is engineered to fit a certain view. And when people move, they do move their religions, they move their politics, they move their educations, etc. And so that is, of course, always going to come into conflict with this making of the nation. But it also is this feedback mechanism that it's like you can't step into the same river twice. We are always engaged in building a new nation. And you think about that with the United States as well, and how immigration, the growth of certain groups, how our changing landmass has made and remade the nation many times over. And the project is just never done. So when I think about migration, I don't think of it as much as a demographic issue as I do a political issue. And it's just another piece in the constant remaking of who we are as a nation.
Yeah, just to jump off on Rebecca's question, oftentimes when you encounter demographic data, yes, you do, on a country level, but oftentimes it's sort of, within a country, different groups, and sort of that on a kind of a comparative, level. One example, is a country I think that has an unusually high birth rate for a Western-ish country, Israel. Right. There's a lot of talk about the ultra-Orthodox birth rate, for example, and what that says about the politics, to your point about that. So, do you find that kind of analysis useful? Sort of by, ethnic group, demographic group, religious group, whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people pay attention to that too at the national level. And you can do this anywhere, right? So the universality of these issues is so important. Like, I write in the book about something we called Sons of the Soil conflict. And I give a couple of examples actually from, I think, Cote d'Ivoire, and a few other places where one group migrates into another group's territory and you end up with conflict. It's just this, it is universal, and it in the setting, you could sub in a different setting, but you see this universally. For any time we can kind of break it down to the subnational level, it's really interesting to see not only what the demographic differences are, but how each group perceives one another. And so the fact that groups are often paying attention to each other's birth rates, to where each other is migrating, to where people are congregating, that overlay of politics and demography, obviously something I'm very interested in.
Okay, let's move to death.
Yeah.
Death. What's the life expectancy in the United States right now, and what do you think are the major factors influencing that?
I am so disappointed in the life expectancy in the United States. So our peers, and not only the overall life expectancy in the U.S., which I think is somewhere between like 76 and 78 right now, but our healthy life expectancy in the U.S. So let me add that piece on there, because since you said we could talk about death, I'll just use this opportunity to say, life expectancy at birth is an indicator, like total fertility rates, of the overall conditions in a society. It's something that should only be going up over time, because presumably, especially if you're a high income country, things should only be getting better. And this has not been the case in the United States. And, if there's anything I think we should be alarmed about in the US, it's actually not the fertility rate. It is on the death side of things. We should be keeping pace with countries that we would hope we would consider peers, like, Japan or countries in Southern Europe. And instead, Russia, China, those are our peers in terms of healthy life expectancy. And And if that is an indicator of the overall trends in the United States, it's something we should be worried about. And we can just put an economic lens on it. I mean, that's just the one that's the easiest to understand. When you have a low healthy life expectancy, and just really quickly, healthy life expectancy, think of it as, the average number of years you would expect to live healthy, then there should be a gap where we all know we will live our last few years of life in less than optimal health. But ideally, you'd want that gap to be as small as possible. Our gap is higher than average for our peer countries, like in the OECD. This means it's going to cost a ton. This is costly, right? Actual outlays in terms of healthcare costs at the national level, but for families as well. Think of the care work that is required when people are in less than optimal health, and how they can't continue to contribute to the economy or contribute to their own savings in ways that they might want to do so. So I think this is really alarming. And I don't know that we know how to fix it. And there's a lot of competing ideas out there.
Do we know what caused it or what may have caused it? Do we have theories?
Yeah, there are a lot of theories about it. I think if we're going to paint with broad brushstrokes, we know that obesity is still a tremendous issue in the U.S. It's down slightly, like barely, but this is still one of the major issues for the U.S. We also know things like fentanyl overdoses are actually down, but still way too high. I think the pieces, and I'm, as you can probably hear, a Southerner, so I certainly know that in my neck of the woods, lifestyle issues contribute, and even in unequal access to healthcare, we know in rural communities, it's becoming harder and harder to access healthcare. There's not an emphasis on preventative care in the U.S. There's controversial statements being made about vaccinations when we know that they could really help. So all of this together, much like fertility rates, paints a picture of lower life expectancy, lower healthy life expectancy than we should have.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, you back to sort of a little bit where we started of like, what's your vision for success? And you look at Europe and you say, these are societies that are relatively affluent. People live relatively healthy and long lives. And yet there's this sense that somehow like the birth rate is, maybe we kind of cover this a little bit, but is like a kind of proxy for like this question of meaning, or this like almost like spiritual ennui. It's oftentimes how it's sort of phrased. So I don't know. I mean, this idea of what is working backwards from like, what does a really good society look like? And I guess ideally we'd want to have a high birth rate and people to live long and for them to be happy. But, maybe, that's kind of utopian. Yeah. So I don't know. I wonder, are these choice? Can we have it all? Or are there kind of trade-offs here where like in a society where people are living longer and they just are less likely? I don't know. Is it kind of like a Rubik's Cube that you can't quite solve the whole thing?
Or are there maybe specific countries that have enacted policies that have worked to affect one of those goals, or maybe all of them, that you could cite?
Yeah, I actually think it's an important question and I'm an optimist. I will say I am still an optimist on this. I think where we keep going wrong is that we have this siloed policymaking. I mean, a little bit to your question, Rebecca, for example, one ministry, like a Ministry of Labor, might do certain sets of policies to meet their goals that then hurt policies made in another ministry. I mean, this is absolutely the case around the world. But I do remain optimistic. I think we're going wrong because we've got the wrong yardstick. So much of what I see is when people want to talk about demographics and policymaking, they're looking at population targets as the measure of success. And this is what we're seeing on the fertility debates right now. Like, how would you know things are going well? Well, then we would have higher fertility rates at all costs. You want everybody to have just there being more babies. That's your yardstick of success. What if they're all leading, terrible lives and wish they'd never been born? That's the wrong yardstick. If we could start to shift the conversation where we think about well-being, which I think this is when you say, what would this perfect society look like? First of all, we've got to get, in the US, 330 million people to say, yes, this is the society that we're going after. This is going to be a bit of a challenge. But there are things I think we could agree on about well-being and how we want to, live longer, healthier lives with meaning. That's pretty universal, but we don't use any measures that show that. We use things like economic growth, but economic growth may not show what that feels like to an individual.
I also think that, and I could be just wrong on this, it just occurred to me, Jennifer, but like certainly as an American, one of, I think our ideas would be giving choice, right? Like liberty, like in a foundational way. But of course, the thing about choice is people may make choices that then don't advance these goals, which I think is what we've seen in a lot of these affluent countries where people who don't, have choice about when or who or whatever to marry, and they make choices that then we say, well, I wish they didn't make those choices. I wish they make different choices. So I wonder about that kind of question of incentivization, policy making, and then just like an ambient climate and how you kind of create that.
And you said something earlier, Rebecca, that I think was in line with this, which was, aren't there some people who would want to have babies kind of for the sake of the nation? So I think putting those two pieces together, we see one of the real obstacles, which is it's really hard to go from the aggregate to the individual or vice versa. So we might say what's good theoretically for the nation is to, move in this certain direction. And then you turn to an individual and you say, okay, go for it. And like, well, not me. Not me. I mean, I think that this other person should do it. And I have been on podcasts before where, pretty directly the host has said, don't you think women need to be having more babies? And I said, are you married and do you have children? Well, no, not me. But shouldn't women be having more babies? Or when people say humanity should, like, this is not helpful. So I think we're still trying to overcome the obstacle of how to jump those levels of analysis.
Yeah, I think I meant it more organically and coming from inside the woman and the man themselves, like the sense that not that I would have children for the nation, but that I live in a nation that I view as good. And therefore, I would like more people to be here and for this nation and its values to carry on over time. I think is really, that's the incentivization piece. Mm-hmm. Somehow we have to communicate to people that there is something good worth preserving. And one way to do that is through having children.
I remember years ago, it just came to me. I was on a date.
This gets good.
No. But this girl who was, she was very, very brilliant. I was in grad school. She was in medical school. And we're just talking, not in a serious way, but she's like, I just want to let you know, like, I'm not going to have kids. And it was healthy, and it was from this kind of altruism of like, I don't want to bring more people into the world. I'd rather spend my time. And she was a psychiatrist in Zambia.
That explains everything.
No, but so I'm not saying that's representative, but I think there this question of optimism, pessimism. How do you view the world? How do you view yourself in the world? Like these assumptions are very much at play. Yes. That was an extreme example, but I think
great act of courage and faith to have a child, let's say, and to be their parent, and so you have to believe in the world into which you are injecting that person, I think. Can I just ask also, we're in the middle of and on the cusp of a huge technological revolution with AI and all the impacts of that are going to change the economics of every country around the planet. Is there some argument to be made that we might not need as many people when we have all those robots doing all these things for us and taking over?
Robot kids.
Right.
Or a robot wife. I don't know, right? I mean, this question.
Some men really find that appealing. They complain too, just so you know.
Most certainly, as all technology does, it's going to benefit some groups, some industries, some particular roles, displace others to their detriment. I don't think this is going to be anything different. Except that what might be most interesting about this one is that the groups being displaced might be groups that have not been displaced in the past, like our high-end knowledge workers. And as we know, anytime there's a shift like this, there are temporary pains before you adjust. This is what we're right here on the cusp of that. So is technology going to come in and totally make up for a shortfall of workers? No, but I expect it will make up for some of it. And then my hope is just that we have policymakers who are not just trying to look for a silver bullet, but who understand that there is no silver bullet and you have to be nimble. You have to be flexible. You have to think long term. Very tough when you're talking about democracies where people are just looking at the next election cycle. But if you're not looking for a silver bullet, you actually can make some real marginal changes. And just so that this doesn't sound abstract, I think about population aging, and I always picture this menu of policy choices. You don't just order one thing from the menu, you order a lot. And so you'd say, all right, AI is going to help with this particular thing, helping people stay in the workforce longer if they are able to do so and want to do so. That's going to take a huge chunk, which, but like that, it actually would be really amazing. Perhaps immigration is also on the menu. It's not just one of these things, it's a combination.
Great. Jennifer Sciubba, thank you so much for joining us. This was great.
Thank you.